I'm Diana Winston, and I'm the Director of Mindfulness Education at UCLA's Mindful Awareness Research Center. I want to talk about the science and research that's going on in the field of mindfulness. It's actually really exciting. There's a lot of interesting research that's been happening. So some of the research is in the area of physical health and the impact that mindfulness has on our physical well-being. So mindfulness seems to positively affect things like high blood pressure. It helps reduce high blood pressure. It affects our cortisol level. It's impactful in terms of the healing response. So there was a famous study done a number of years ago where they looked at people who have psoriasis. And what they did, the typical treatment for psoriasis is that you get UVB rays, almost like a tanning booth. And so one group went in and got the regular UVB ray treatment, and the other group did the same treatment, but with a mindfulness CD, which they practiced along. The group that practiced with the mindfulness healed 4 times faster than the other group. And so when we look at all these research studies, these 1,000 studies, across the board, the one thing we find out is that mindfulness makes people happier. So an interesting study was done recently where they beeped people on smartphones. They had 2,200 people across the United States, and they beeped them at random intervals throughout the day. And they asked them 3 questions. 1, what are you doing right now? 2, is your mind on it? And 3, how's your mood? The people who were paying attention to what they were doing reported being happier, even if they were doing something they didn't really like. But because their mind was on it, they reported an increase in happiness. Mindfulness is also helpful with attention. So a study was done out of UCLA a number of years ago where we studied both adolescents and adults who have attention deficit disorder or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And they studied mindfulness and practiced it over an 8-week period, and they found that the ability to pay attention improved over this 8-week period, quite significantly, actually. So much so that people said, what was the medication? And it turned out, we said, no, it was meditation, not medication. And one of the most famous studies done in 2005 out of Harvard looked at the brains of long-term meditators. These were the people who've been living in caves, practicing for 20 or 30 years. And they hooked up their brains and they studied it to see what differences they would find. And what they found was these long-term meditators, you might think of them as the Olympic athletes of meditation, right? Their brains were different than people of the same age. I don't know if you know this, but actually, as we get older, our brains thin out. Meditation prevented these people from having this age-related decline, particularly in 2 areas. The prefrontal cortex, and the prefrontal cortex is what we might call the CEO of our brain. It's responsible for executive functioning, for delayed gratification, for working memory, and for flexible thinking. The prefrontal cortex was thicker in people who practiced meditation, and also the insular cortex, which is responsible for regulating and synthesizing information from the body. One recent study that just came out showed that if you meditate over 8 weeks, just 27 minutes a day, they noticed minute structural changes in the brain as well, also in the prefrontal cortex and in another area which they connect to both compassion and self-awareness. Mindfulness is also helpful with obsessive-compulsive disorder, mindfulness for depression, for anxiety. And so when we look at all these research studies, these 1,000 studies, across the board, the one thing we find out is that mindfulness makes people happier.